Okay, this is a very brief lesson on the military history of the American Revolution from Mr. Chandler for my dual credit U.S. history students as well as my Lonestar College students. All right, so very quickly, I'm going to just go over advantages and disadvantages of both sides. The British have the advantage of having a much larger army, very powerful navy, and experienced and well-trained troops. However, a big problem is their attention was divided. Much of their army was bogged down in Ireland as well as other locations around the empire. Lack of public support for the war. Every year, the Whig Party, which mostly opposed the war, gained seats in Parliament due to the fact that the British people overwhelmingly were against the war, not necessarily because they sympathized with the Americans so much as because of the economic damage it was doing to the country, though many of them did also sympathize. Most of the generals in the British military, particularly in America, were not good, did poor jobs, as we'll see. They were poorly supplied, mainly just because their supply line was stretched across an ocean. Uh, on that note, they also had the issue that, it would take 6 months really to be able to effectively communicate. And so that made it really hard for them to coordinate the war from home. And probably the number one most important reason the British lost the war is that to beat the Americans, they had to utterly defeat them completely, take them over. Whereas the Americans just have to keep fighting until the British get tired of fighting, which brings us to the American advantages. Um, so yeah, the second one you see there only had to defend until the British get tired of fighting. This is similar to our war in Vietnam that we will study next semester. Um, Militarily, we were beating the Vietnamese very handily, but ultimately it didn't really matter because to beat North Vietnam, we would have to completely and utterly take over. And for them to beat us, they just had to keep fighting till the American people, um, got tired of it, which they did. Similarly, the Americans just had to keep fighting until the British got tired of fighting, which they did. Another very key advantage are foreign allies eventually. We'll talk about that in a minute. They had home field advantage, which has a number of important benefits to it. And the American colonies were mostly agricultural and rural, so the British blockade doesn't really stop the Americans from at least feeding their armies for the most part. And because the population is mostly rural, the British were able to capture almost every American city, major city, and it didn't really matter because the Americans didn't live in the cities. But the Americans had disadvantages. They were disorganized, a lot of sectional jealousy. This region doesn't want to help this region, doesn't want to help that one. They were low on money for much of the war. They were poorly supplied for most of the war. Um, the Americans relied heavily on the militias, who were well trained and numerous, but not reliable because they were kind of loyal to their colony and tied to their colony or state as they became. And then the Americans did develop a regular army called the Continental Army, but it was mostly understaffed, underfunded, undermanned, and very unreliable, poorly trained, not great troops. So as you can see, if you look at the British versus the Americans on paper, it really looked like the British just would dominate the Americans, and nobody really expected the Americans to be successful in this war. Even early on, the Americans were mostly just hoping to get the British to accede to some of their demands for representation. But ultimately, in hindsight, we can see the Americans actually had some really important advantages that gave them the win. Now we're going to look at, I'm going to skip over the Patriots and Loyalists. We talked about that in class already. I thought this was neat. This is the image on the cover of the 5th edition of Give Me Liberty Volume 1. It's the destruction of the royal statue in New York. It's a French drawing by Francois Haberman, who actually witnessed the colonists tearing down the statue of King George III in Bowling Green Park in New York City in 1776. And then they ended up melting the statue down for cannonballs later, at least so I've read. What I thought was really neat is that, as you can tell from the image, how it's got these yellows and reds, those are to give it a 3D effect when you view it through a zogroscope. So I thought it was pretty neat that they had 3D pictures way back in the 1700s. But anyway, here is a painting from 80 years later showing a very different version of that event, showing you how kind of the telephone game of time, so to speak, causes things to be remembered differently. Here's just a painting of some American foot soldiers done by a French officer, showing you some of the different styles. So you can see a black soldier from the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which was an all-black unit. They wore all white. And then you can see a Continental Army soldier there, a militiaman, and then I believe this is a Continental Army officer here at the far right. Anyway, there's some troops. So let's talk about the battles you need to know. I'm not really focusing on very many big ones. The first big one we're going to learn about is the Battle of Trenton. So for context, George Washington was holed up in New York City. The British came under the command of General Howe, H-O-W-E. General Howe's brother, Admiral Howe, in charge of the Navy, was supposed to prevent Washington's escape by bridge, but he allowed Washington to escape, supposedly because he was hoping that the war would be ended soon without too much bloodshed. So Washington managed to escape, and he and his army made their way to New Jersey. They passed through the town of Princeton, and then from Princeton crossed the Delaware River just on the other side of Trenton, New Jersey, where they made a camp. They destroyed all the bridges going across the river. It's actually a pretty ingenious thing they did, where they left all their campfires burning and left a few scouts with rowboats walking around the camps so that the British scouts would see a full army camped on the north side of the Delaware River and wait to approach them until the morning. When the British Army got there in the morning, they found an empty camp and also discovered that every bridge for about 50 miles in either direction up the river, not every bridge, every boat had been stolen or destroyed. And there's only one bridge which Washington's troops were well guarding. And so the British commander Mawood sent a German mercenary general, Johann Rall, with his troops to occupy the town of Trenton while he stayed back behind in the town of Princeton, New Jersey. There are little girls being extremely loud in the hallway right now. Sorry about that. Anyway, so what happened is what led to my very favorite U.S. history meme, America, we will kill you in your sleep on Christmas. This is the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. And what many Americans don't know is that he is crossing the Delaware on the night, not the day, on the night of December 25th, though technically it's actually probably early morning but still it's dark outside. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning on December 26th. So what happened is you had the German troops, the Hessians or Hessians, camped in Trenton, and they were celebrating Christmas because in the traditional rules of Christian nations, they do not participate in warfare on Christmas or Easter. So all night long, the Americans could hear the sound of Germans singing Christmas carols, having a nice time. Washington split his army into multiple parts, and they crossed the Delaware River at different points, and they all converged on the town of Trenton at about 8 o'clock in the morning on December 26th, where they found the Germans mostly still asleep and not ready for them. German General Johann Rall actually stepped out of his front door still in his night clothes and was shot in the stomach as he opened his door, to give you some perspective. And so it was an overwhelming defeat, as you can see here in this chart here, with the Americans only having 2 people die, both of them having died of exposure from the cold, whereas the Germans had 22 killed, 83 wounded, but most importantly, between 900 and 1,000 captured. All right. So anyway, this is a really big win for the Americans, even though in terms of actual numbers, it's a really small battle and not a really big win. But it's a big win because it helps build popular support for Washington and the war, and leads to a lot of people coming and joining the Continental Army. Washington follows this up with a quick win at the Battle of Princeton as well, though at that battle he allowed nearly 1,000 of the 1,200 British soldiers there to escape back to New York. But still, this is a really big win for Washington. But the really big win, what historians usually refer to as the turning point of the American Revolution, is the Battle of Saratoga. Battle of Saratoga takes place, let me bring us a map here. So you can see up here, Saratoga, New York, right up here. So what happened was British gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, with about 9,000 British soldiers, headed down the St. Lawrence River, where he defeated the American general, Gates, Horatio Gates, at the Battle of Ticonderoga. Gates quickly escaped and made his way south toward Albany, where he was met by forces under other commanders, where they essentially laid an ambush for Burgoyne. They caught Burgoyne pretty much with his pants down, so to speak, because Burgoyne, nicknamed, as I mentioned, Gentleman Johnny, had some major weaknesses. One big weakness of Burgoyne was that he liked to travel around with wagon loads full of his clothes and fancy furniture and china and stuff like that. So he had a really long supply train stretched out, which was was a really big tactical blunder. The Americans caught him, thanks in large part to American General Benedict Arnold, who, in violating orders, led a cavalry charge across a field that prevented Burgoyne's escape. It is in this charge that Benedict Arnold was shot in the leg, leading to his a permanent disability, which kind of helps kick in the chain of events that eventually helps somewhat justify, in his mind at least, his betrayal of the Americans. But anyway, Burgoyne is defeated, and it's a really big defeat, as we can see on this chart here. 7,200 killed in the first battle. 6,600 killed in this. Or I'm sorry, not that. I'm sorry. 440 killed total. 6,222 captured. 695 wounded, compared to just 90 Americans killed and 240 wounded. So it's an overwhelming victory for the American side. It's a really big win for the Americans. It's a really big win for Horatio Gates, who gets really all of the credit for this, and which is another reason Benedict Arnold is going to have some sour grapes. And here's a painting of, here's Horatio Gates, and he's accepting the surrender of Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne. What he's doing actually is Burgoyne is handing him his sword, and Horatio Gates is saying, "No, sir, you can keep your sword," as a show of respect for Burgoyne. I believe that this person here leaning on the cannon is Benedict Arnold, just based on other paintings I've seen of him, but I could be wrong. I'm not sure who any of the other people are. But yeah, this is a really big win for the American side. This is the turning point of the war because, and this is really important, this is kind of the final straw that convinces the French, and by extension the Spanish, to join the Americans. So the French had been kind of holding back on whether or not they were going to support the American side. They obviously want to support us because the British are their enemy, but they didn't feel confident that we could win. And they don't want to jump in on our side and then we lose, and then that puts them as enemies of Britain. So they were waiting for us to have a really big win. This is a big win, and it convinces the French, okay, yeah, they can do this. And so the French join our side, and they supply us with troops, supplies, and their navy, which is able to break the blockade and get the supplies and troops in, obviously. The Spanish also join our side, not militarily, but supply-wise, following the French doing so. So Saratoga is extremely important turning point because it helps us to gain our vital European allies, without whom we probably would not have won the war. The final battle we're going to learn about is the Battle of Yorktown. So the troops in the south for the British were put under the command of General Cornwallis, who mostly was winning battle after battle after battle, but he moved his troops after the Battle of the Cowpens. His defeated the Battle of Cowpens in January of 1781. He withdrew his troops to Greensboro, where he defeated General Nathaniel Greene, who was probably the most talented American general. He defeats General Greene and then pulls his troops back because his defeat of, all right, so to kind of reiterate, he loses at Cowpens. He wins at Greensboro, but it's not a very great win. It's kind of a win where he loses a lot of men. And so he then retreats his troops first to Wilmington, Virginia, and then up to Yorktown, Virginia, where the idea is they will hole up in Yorktown, which is kind of a very defensible hill fort town, and they'll wait there and wait out the fall and winter there, and then resume their southern campaign in the spring. So George Washington really wants to march his troops straight up to New York City and take New York, but a group of his officers and his French allies kind of corner him in his tent and convince him, no, we've got to attack Yorktown. And so finally he relents, very much against his own judgment, which is good because Washington is pretty bad at making decisions. So this is a good decision, his decision to let other people make the decision. And so the way this battle works is our army is split into 4 parts. 3 of them converge on Yorktown from the south, while another goes across the river and attacks the Gloucester Heights, where there's big anti-ship cannons that they can take control of. Cornwallis is then basically under bombardment and siege from out here, while also from his own guns up on the Gloucester Heights. And then the French Navy comes, destroying any chance that the British Navy was going to come and help. And so Cornwallis ends up surrendering on October 19th, 1781, surrendering his army of over 7,600 troops. And so ultimately, Cornwallis's defeat there, the British still have tens of thousands of troops in America. They are by no means defeated, but at this point, once the Battle of Yorktown, the news of the defeat at Yorktown reaches London, the ambassadors in London meet with the American ambassador in London, John Adams, future President John Adams, and say, let's talk peace. And it takes nearly 2 years to come up with a treaty, but they do come up with the treaty called the Treaty of Paris. And so in the Treaty of Paris, essentially what we get is, 1, Britain officially recognizes the legitimacy and independence of the United States of America, which is this green area on the map, basically everything west of the Mississippi River. For their help in the war, Spain gets all of the Louisiana Territory back. Did they get they got the Louisiana Territory in the French Indian War. Forget that, sorry. So forget that. So 1, the British officially recognize the legitimacy of the United States. 2, the U.S. recognizes Britain's right to Canada, which is this pink area here. Though there will be a dispute over this area here, you can see, and over this area here. Those disputes will actually be settled in the War of 1812. as is this disputed land here between the United States and Spain that will also be settled later. And 3, the United States agrees to return all property or reimburse for all property lost by loyalists. So any loyalists who had their land confiscated or their property confiscated or destroyed will have it all returned, or they'll be reimbursed for it by the United States. Now that's in the treaty. The U.S. does not abide by that. And that's one of the issues that causes tension that will later lead to the War of 1812. Meanwhile, I'm sorry, there's another condition, number 4. The British agree that they will get the Indians in this territory to not be hostile. They do not really go through with that. They also agree to remove their troops from from former French forts, from Canadian forts in this area. They also do not fully do that. So what's going to happen is, as we get toward 1812, the United States and the British are getting more and more upset with each other over both sides not fully abiding by the treaty, and they're going to use that. That's going to become part of the what legitimizes the War of 1812 for both sides. But that is something we'll talk about later. And that is a very brief military history of the American Revolution. Thank you. For sources, I was using 100% entirely Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty, Volume 1, 5th edition by Norton Publishers. So anyway, have a good